Good evening, everyone. Assuming, Keith, that the sound is fine, I'll carry on unless I'm told otherwise. So, I'm Tim, I'm an addict, very glad to be here. And our topic this evening, I'm afraid I've given it rather a provocative title, Turning to the Father of Light. Um, Now, don't worry about that. We're going to come at that slowly. Uh, what we've covered so far is the general catastrophe of alcoholism, and we've already hopefully established that the only thing which is going to save us is somehow God coming in between me and the first drink or drug or hit or whatever it is. So we should be all right with the notion. The question is, how does one activate that relationship with God? And if you come at it the right way, it's not too bad. If you try and rush at it without preparing, it's very difficult. And the book's very clever. So by page 60, it's got us down with the idea that we're going to need a power greater than ourselves. And then it spends a couple of pages talking about the failure of self in general. But there are all sorts of other things which are scattered through the book which are preparing us for this. Now, the prerequisites for this, the first surrender, what I mean by the first surrender is the first time you say, right, I'm going to take step 3. There are going to be a gazillion surrenders after that. It certainly won't be the last surrender you'll ever experience. What I'm talking about here is the first time you say, right, I want to do what CA is saying, I want to do what AA is saying, whatever the fellowship, I'm going to turn my will and life over to God. Very good. The first prerequisite is complete surrender. And page 156 is a wonderful quotation. Here was a prospect all right, but by the description, none too promising. The use of spiritual principles in such cases was not so well understood as it is now. Now, what that means is you'd think that someone who's intelligent and together and is able to understand things very easily is going to be the easiest sell, and it's actually quite the reverse. I only really go to God as the absolute last resort, when, as it says, the scorecards read 0. My sponsor talks about not picking unripe apples. If you've got any vested interest left in the material world, if you think that the material life is going to save you, you might need a bit longer first. Just go and work that one out of your system. Because the trouble is with trying to, as it were, ride the spiritual horse and riding the material horse at the same time, you end up being strung up between the two horses. The second prerequisite is this question of desire. If he is to find God, the desire must come from within. I think I may have mentioned before, I've had a couple of situations with sponsees where, you're so desperate for them to get it. It's taken years for a person to really ask for help from someone who's got a reasonable grasp of the program. And you're so pleased for them, but you're more pleased for them than they are. And there's all of the sighing, the puffing, and the 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 long drawn out breaths. There's a line, of course, we're all very familiar with it, but I think sometimes we're so familiar we forget what it says. If you have decided you want what we have, and the decision is a decision about wanting, it's a decision about desire. If the emotion is out of whack with the intellectual recognition that one needs the program, the emotion's always going to win. You can override it temporarily to get yourself out of bed or to get yourself to a meeting, but there's no basis for recovery. The next prerequisite for this first surrender is this notion of giving up self. And we covered the failure of self last week, hopefully adequately. And this is where this notion of the Father of Light comes in. It comes from Bill's story. So by the time we're at page 63, about to take step 3, we ought to have been used to the idea that Bill introduces back on page 14. And it's got a couple of ideas, this. Simple but not easy. A price had to be paid. It meant destruction of self-centeredness. I must turn in all things to the Father of Light who presides over us all. Now that's got a couple of elements. The thing to get through my thick skull is no amount of acclaim or popularity or praise or so-called validation from other people is going to touch the sides. No satisfaction in material needs is going to do anything. I'm told by my anthropologist and sociologist friends, of whom I have none, that in the West people are not particularly happier than they are anywhere else, even though the material needs are by and large satisfied pretty universally. The attainment of ambitions. I live in the shadow of the towers of the financial district of London, the City of London. I run through the city. People do not seem happier there than in the neighbouring boroughs where there is considerable poverty. The attainment of ambition doesn't seem to achieve anything. The basis for getting rid of self-centeredness is not being good, it's because it doesn't work. But even more than that, when it says, I must turn in all things to the Father of Light who presides over us all, I don't, but at least on a lot of days, I don't do that first thing. What I do is I turn to myself and say, I wonder what's going on. Let's look at my life. Let's look at the world. I decide what is going on all by myself, and then I upset myself. Then people say, how are you? And I say, I'm very upset. And then I cite external circumstances as the reason I'm upset. They're not the reason I'm upset. The reason I'm upset is I turn to myself, rather my ego. The ego and the self are seen as synonymous in the book, and asked it for an assessment of the day. It gave me a depressing assessment of the day, and now I'm depressed. And you'd think I'd get over this at some point and stop doing it. Apparently not. Apparently it's the lesson I need to learn on a daily basis. I'm not to turn to myself for advice. I'm to turn to God, or as it says, the Father of Light. And also, the next point, the prerequisites, these prerequisites as I'm calling them for the first surrender, giving up dependence on the external. We need to get rid of the X and turn it into dependence on the eternal. One of the three quotations, burn the idea into the consciousness of every man, this is in page 98, that he can get well regardless of anyone. I might add the word anything. The only condition is that he trust in God and clean house. And in the previous line, it does really expand that to the everything, job or no job, wife or no wife. We simply do not stop drinking so long as we place dependence upon other people ahead of dependence on God. Now, what does this dependence on other people or dependence on the world mean? It means that I have made the decision at some level that I can only be happy if certain requirements are fulfilled. And it's going to have said on page 62, I think. At some point, we made a decision based on self, which later placed us in a position to be hurt. What this means is, I've decided that my happiness depends on a particular array of circumstances outside of myself. I have to cut the dependence on this, at least in principle. I've got to understand the idea. It might take a lifetime to really cut the dependence. But I've got to get the idea through into my thick skull. Now, a lot of what I'm saying today is a repetition of what I've said on other days, but what I'm trying to do is bring together all of the threads of the nature of the solution, and then we're going to cover how it gets put into practice. What I'd like to talk about next is the absolute nature of what is on offer. And we've got two quotations. I saw that my friend was much more than inwardly reorganized. He was on a different footing. His roots grasped a new soil. So we're talking about, as I said last week, not a bolt-on to the material life, but an alternative to it. There's a French novel, a novel in French. Is a Lebanese author who writes in French called Amin Malouf, who I'm prepared to say this, so I'm going to get it wrong, but there's a chap who goes to visit an old school friend who he was at school with in Beirut. And this chap is now a monk, I think living as a hermit in the mountains. And he says to the monk, it's an oasis out here. And the monk says, no, you've got it backwards. The world is an oasis. From a distance, it looks absolutely marvelous. But you get up close, it's full of camels which smell and are angry, and all of the people are angry and ill-treating the camels, and it's a mess, and it's disorganized, and it's smelly, and it's awful. That's an oasis. Here, in what you're calling the oasis, is the endless expanse of the universe. So what I'm giving up is the oasis of the world for the endless expanse of the universe. The second quotation is hard. When many hundreds of people are able to say that the consciousness of the presence of God is today the most important fact of their lives, they present a powerful reason why one should have faith. Now, for me, that's difficult. I'm not a spiritual person. If you want a spiritual speaker, you have to get someone else. I'm not someone that feels or senses the presence of God in the room 24 hours a day. I don't have a fluffy relationship with God. I have a relationship with God, but it is not fluffy. It is not in the colours of Hello Kitty. Hello Kitty is in the colours of Hello Kitty. My relationship with God is something else entirely. And if you ask me at any point of the day, what is the most important fact? It's usually the single small thing that is bothering me that day. On any given day, there's usually one thing which is going wrong. And rather like the princess and the pea, it doesn't matter how many mattresses you stick under me, I can still feel that one thing which is not quite right. That, on any given day, is the most important fact of my life. But I understand what this reading says. Running through everything, even in my most cynical or gloomy moments or periods, there is a fundamental awareness that beyond the material world, everything is all right, and I have always been all right, and I am going to be all right, and everything is really all right now, even though I can't see it. It is the one fundamental fact which is belied by all of the evidence of the world and sometimes the evidence of my life. It is the most important fact. It is the fact without which hope would not be possible in a condition of hopelessness. This is, I may have said last week, the point about hope. If you could be hopeful because conditions were hopeful, you wouldn't need hope. It wouldn't be a question. You only need hope if you're completely hopeless, if all of the evidence is pointing the other way. So believing in God is completely mad. But do you have an alternative? I don't. In Chuck Chamberlain's A New Pair of Glasses, which is really a transcript of his talks, which I'm very grateful for. The voice I can't get on with, but the transcript I get on with very well. He says if he thought there were one problem in his life which couldn't be solved, he'd jump off a bridge. And I know exactly what he means. If I thought there was one problem which could not ultimately be solved, forget it. So the most important fact is the existence of God and the availability of a channel to God. Now, what I think I want from that channel is great oodles and lashings of comfort. Sometimes I get that. Sometimes all I get is, next right action, next right action, next right action. But the channel is real. It just doesn't have truffles coming down it the whole time. It's got tasks to do, it's got things to do. And eventually the difficulty passes, the mood passes, my perspective is restored to sanity. Now, the two elements of the relationship with God are beautifully summed up in this passage from page 14. There, I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction, and we're going to talk about those. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. So, care. This means I'm going to be looked after. And it says on page 63, so we're in real step 3 territory now. We had a new employer. Being all powerful, he provided what we needed if we kept close to him and performed his work well. So there are two conditions there. I've got to stay close to God and I've got to perform his work well. I was talking to someone recently who said they didn't have a good relationship with God, or they didn't feel God's presence or something like that. I'm not asked to do that. I'm not asked to make God be close to me. I'm asked to be close to God. Those are two very different things. Being close to God means I keep saying to God, what shall I do now? What shall I do next? What shall I think about this? Save me from me. Save me from me. 100 times a day. Save me from me. That's me staying close to God. Whether I'm aware of God being close, as it were, on the other side of that equation is neither here nor there. There are days you feel it, there are days you don't. And performed his work well. His work is whatever I think God's will is. It's about sincerity. Even if I get it wrong, but I think it's God's will, I get the same score for this. Now, this notion, we're okay if we keep up our side of the bargain. What you'll have noticed in the material world, if you've paid attention to it, is sometimes bad things in a material sense, or things which are conventionally, traditionally thought of as bad, illness, premature death, loss, all of those things, happen to people who are godly and religious and kind and pious and whatever, have 100 other virtues. Now, I read the book on the premise that they put what is in there because it's right. So the book is not right because it's the book, but they put it in there because it's right. So let's just proceed on the basis that it's right. So let's say God is going to look after me, but rotten things, or things conventionally thought of as rotten, can happen to me. There's an apparent contradiction there. Therefore, the thing that these bad events, so-called bad events, are happening to is not me. A friend of mine many years ago, I say friend, I think there's been a demotion to acquaintance, but anyway, a former friend who is now an acquaintance would say in step 4, when we're resentful, we're not asked to say how it affected us. We're asked to say how the disagreeable event affected my something or other, my ambitions, my security, my physical life, my relationships, my reputation, my self-esteem. Those are the things that I possess. They're not the thing that I am. God doesn't promise anywhere that the things that I have will be protected. What I'm promised is that I will be protected. If I am attached to those ships, as it were, and those ships go down and are shipwrecked, I will go down with them if I'm on those ships. Hence, if those ships in aggregate are the self, hence the abandonment of self, the abandonment of my attachment to reputation, self-esteem, relationships with other people, pocketbooks, security, and ambitions. They might not be all right. Things might not be okay. If you're an Al-Anon, they might die. There we go. So step 3 doesn't mean those things which I'm attached to are going to turn out the way I want. The promise is that I will be okay even if they go to hell in a handbasket. Many years ago, I heard Pauline, who got sober somewhere around the Ted Heath government, and she's still alive, still sober today. She had a business for 20 years, and the world changed and the industry she worked in vanished. The thing that she did was no longer a thing which people could do for a living. And someone said to her in a meeting, "You're so brave, being so cheerful after having failed in business." And she said, "I didn't fail. The business failed. I was a complete success." That's what's promised. If life is an examination, I think in some ways it is. It's other things too. It's a roller coaster ride and a theme park and a curriculum. Anne Lamott says the world is forgiveness school, and the textbook is very thick. If life is I shouldn't laugh at my own jokes. If life is an examination, the marking scheme is not what I think it is. The marking scheme is not money, power, prestige. It's not sex and popularity and looks and appearance. It's 2 things. Did I stay close to God? Did I seek God? And did I try to do the things that I thought were God's will? That is it. That's how to ace the test, not by anything external. And you can't tell how well you're doing spiritually by how well you're doing externally. A friend of mine who is a history teacher says it's always struck him as ironic that the Germans marching into Poland in 1939 had on their belt buckles, "God with us." And they did rather well for a while in their own terms. Doing well externally doesn't mean I'm doing God's will. And it can go on for a long time. I can be mistaken about that for a very long time indeed. If things are an absolute catastrophe externally, that does not mean that I'm doing my will. Sometimes, who knows why, the Book of Job touches upon this. The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis touches on this. A lot of philosophy, the whole philosophical domain of theodicy covers this very difficult question of why there is such a mismatch between people's valor and virtue on one hand, and morality and material success. It's a little bit of a mystery, but it's there. The fact there is a question, a case to be answered, can't be denied. But what matters for our purposes, there's a line in the New Testament, if you'll forgive me for quoting it, where Jesus says something like, you'll be burned, but not a hair of your head will be harmed. You'll go through fire, but not a hair of your head will be harmed. One will go through the most extraordinary things sober and clean, but not a hair of one's head. In other words, what really matters, one's spirit won't be harmed. And one is offered protection on that level. Some protection, you might say, but there we go, that's what it is. Now, direction is the other side of this. We got 4 quotations here. It's going to be too much to talk about all of them, so I'm just going to pick one of them. Here's a good one. Okay, so I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. Now, asking God what to do is not the most straightforward thing, because when God speaks, I mean, this will be a whole topic in step 11, but when God speaks, he uses the three channels of inspiration, intuitive thought, or a decision, as it says on page 86. Trouble is, ego uses the same three channels as well. So you can't tell by the channel whether it's come from God or not. I had a friend many years ago who would say 2 or 3 times a week that she would have a massive realization. And she was always phoning up these massive realizations. I have about 2 a year if I'm lucky, but she had several a week. And once it was in the middle of a meeting, she was sharing, she stood up and she said, I've had a massive realization. She stopped sharing, she picked up her bag and coat, she left the room, we never saw her again. I don't know what the massive realization was. Maybe that was God, but who knows? Massive realizations, the fact of having realized something and it being massive is not a sign it's come from God. Might be, it might not. There are lots of tests. Is it God's will? But essentially, there is no way of bypassing the very difficult job of learning how to discern what is God's will. And one's got to use intelligence and common sense and experience and patience and self-honesty. One has to cultivate sincerity. One has to learn how to apply the steps, the traditions and the concepts. One has to learn who to ask advice from. If you're asking advice from one, if I'm asking advice from one person, I might well genuinely be asking for advice. If I'm asking two people, I'm looking round for an opinion which fits what I've already decided to do. If I'm asking advice to a room of people or a whole Facebook group, I'm not looking for advice, I'm looking for something else. And one can make the most tremendous mistakes. The point, though, is that one should at least be sincerely wanting to move in the direction of doing the right thing, not doing what one wants to do. Being motivated by the object of living a life that is worthwhile rather than the object of making oneself feel better. Now, the nature of this relationship with God that I'm about to enter into in step 3, this relationship of seeking the care of God in return for following the direction of God. So those are the two things. I'm putting my half into it, and then God is putting God's. It's more than half. It's 99%. This care business. But the nature of the relationship is it's both spiritual and practical. And the centerpiece is the page 130 quotation. And the center of that says, we have come to believe that he would like us to keep our heads in the clouds with him, but that our feet ought to be firmly planted on earth. In other words, actions should remain constructive, and I need to remain busy. As my first sponsor said, the worst thing for an addict is unstructured free time. I need to keep myself nice and busy. But I need to have my head in the clouds. What does that mean? Well, if you think about what the opposite is, to have your head on the ground and your feet in the air. The feet in the air because you're doing absolutely nothing. But what does it mean to have my head on the ground? To have my head taken up excessively with the material nuts and bolts of my everyday life, with what he's doing and she's doing and they're doing and what they're thinking, with material things, essentially, the things of the material world. If I spend too long there, I become toxified by it. I've got to have my thoughts placed on a plane of higher values. Now, frankly, most of the day I'm engaged in activities and occupations, and I'm not really having my head anywhere. My mind is technically concentrating on this or that. I do a very, very technical job, so my mind is thinking about that. I'm talking about those idle moments when there isn't a task to be done, when there isn't a person to be listened to, when there isn't a book to be read. What am I doing? that's when I must let go. When you let go of something physically, it drops to the ground. When you let go of something spiritually, you rise up. So I need to detach from the things of the world, detach from other people. I rise up, and from on high, from a higher place, I can deal with what is going on in the world without being caught in the crossfire. To not get caught in the crossfire above, in the world, one has to be above the crossfire mentally. Now, there are terms of this. I can't find. Oh, here's a quotation. We found God does not make too hard terms with those who seek him. Now that sounds terribly nice. People quote that the whole time, as if to say, well, this makes things terribly easy. God doesn't make too hard terms. Easy peasy. Get on with it. You'll be absolutely fine. What it means is this, however, it's the opposite. It doesn't say he doesn't make terms. If there were no terms, the words too hard would be redundant. So piece of bad news number one is there are terms for this relationship. It gets worse. If the terms were not hard, the word too would be redundant. Therefore, the terms are hard. One can't conceal this from people, because one will then be accused of the so-called bait and switch, the technique of the salesman who purports to be selling one product, but when you sign on the bottom line, you discover you've been sold quite a different product. The terms are hard, but they're not too hard. And when you look at the alternative, which in my case would be suicide or relapse, then they're not too hard at all. They're a walk in the park compared to the terms that alcohol or materialism. The terms of materialism. You want hard terms? Those are materialism says to be happy, you've got to be successful in the world. Think of the terms that that imposes. To be happy, materialism says, you have to ignore the fact that you could die at any moment. Keep that out of your mind at all times, you'll be just fine. That's too hard terms. No wonder half the country is drugged. I don't blame them. So the terms of this, the first term is this notion of internal seeking. We finally saw that faith in some kind of God was a part of our makeup, just as much as the feeling we have for a friend. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly, but he was there. He was as much a fact as we were. And then it says, in the last analysis, it is only there that he may be found. It was so with us. Now, people might say, well, how do you do that? And what people want to do is they look for techniques. A friend of mine he went on a very, very expensive trip to Nepal to learn a technique to find God within. Whether he found God within is between him and God, presumably. I know that he came back and he was absolutely floating. I've never seen someone so floating. 2 weeks later, he called me up with a resentment against one of his colleagues. So that, that was a very expensive trip for a fairly short effect. Now, the thing is, I don't need special techniques here. Everyone knows how to go within. Because whenever you've gone within to worry about things which aren't happening right now, you've gone within. The thing isn't happening out there, it's happening within. One knows how to go within. And one imagines a space, a room. If you want to furnish the room, if you want the space to be a natural space, whatever you like. And you imagine that in the room, there is just you and God. And if you happen to be Catholic and believe in the Trinity and the saints, then you can populate that room with an awful lot of people. Certain other traditions are far more austere on the question. But in any case, It might be you and Jesus, it might be you and God, it might be you and the Buddha, it might be you and nature spirits. It doesn't matter what it is. Something. You and whatever your concept of the higher power is. And you say, God, I'm completely jiggered. I'm kippered. I do not know how to carry on for one more minute. I'm 1,000 years old, and I appear to be no better at handling the ordinary everyday ups and downs of the material life than I was 30, 40, 50 years ago. Help me. If you're there, give me a sign. Tell me something to think. Tell me something to do. Just give me something here. And then you shut up and see what happens. That's it. There's nothing special about this. Now, if you want to do techniques, good for you. Go and do some techniques. I mean, there are lots of things you can do, and I'm sure lots of them are very helpful. I've found, personally, nothing more helpful than the simple notion of going inside, shutting the door, and spending some time knowing that you are in the presence of God, and see what happens. So that's the first term of the set of terms. One must seek internally. Sometimes people can get very busy with the steps and all of these written inventories. Those are necessary, but they're not a substitute for the internal seeking. The second element of the terms is the completion of the follow-up actions. And there are a couple of quotations here which I'm going to refer to parts of. The first one is a little bit chilling. So it's from the doctor's opinion. So when Ebby is in the process of 12th stepping, though he wouldn't have called it that, 12th stepping Bill, he sets out the program and he says, my friend promised when these things were done, I would enter upon a new relationship with my creator. Now that means there has been a relationship, but it's a relationship of temporary grace, which will run out at some point if the actions are not taken. But certain things need to be done. In other words, the forgiveness must be 360 degrees. Now, one might struggle with that and stutter a bit, but in principle, one must forgive 360 degrees around everyone. The confession has to be complete. The amends, one has to do one's utmost to straighten out the past, to use the phrase on page 77. It's got to be done, and done means completed. Not in God's time, in my time. Man goes to this is one of my favourite stories. Man goes to a rabbi. Um, no, sorry. Rabbi goes to a tailor with a coat and says, will you mend the coat? And the tailor says, uh, I'll mend your coat. God willing, it'll be done by tomorrow. Rabbi comes back the next day. It's not done. He says to the tailor, when will it be done then? And the tailor says, it'll be done tomorrow. And the rabbi comes back the third day and says to the tailor, when will the coat be done? The tailor says, God willing, it'll be done tomorrow. And the rabbi says, and if we leave God out of it? So all of this in God's time. I'm waiting for God, but God's waiting for me. I need to complete this. Clancy says the steps don't care why you take them. I think there's a great truth in that. But piling the actions of the steps on top of a continued belief in self produces the most intractable chaos. It's the biggest problem, I think. I've experienced it myself, and I've seen it in so many people who've asked me to sponsor them. They're in a terrible state. And you say, have you done the steps? They said, I've done the steps many times. Now, the truth is, there are always lots of gaps in the amends, but they've gone through the process. the writing which could fill 100 ring binders. But without the initial recognition that I cannot trust my own thinking, therefore, why am I talking? Without that first recognition that my mind is a closed economic system with one side manufacturing bullshit and the other side buying it, without that fundamental humility, one can do all of the actions one wants and it just produces confusion. It doesn't produce peace. But the actions do need to be taken. Now, the last element of the terms. So the first thing is to search within, and we've got the surrender elements afterwards, but once one engages in the relationship, the terms of internal seeking, completion of the first 9 steps, and then what I term ongoing work as an agent. And if you want to know what your role in the universe is, you don't have to think about it or read a book except the big book, because it tells you on page 49. Instead of regarding ourselves as intelligent agents, spearheads of God's ever-advancing creation, that's telling us what we should be doing. It's telling me what I should be an agent. In other words, I should go through the world. Imagine a shipping agent. So imagine a Greek or a South Korean, one of these huge shipping firms, which is sending container ships all around the world. And these container ships dock in lots of different ports. So uh, they'll dock in Tilbury, they'll dock in Riga, they'll dock in all sorts of places. And imagine you're a shipping agent in Riga. Your job on behalf of the owner of the ship, whose cargo it is, your job is to arrange all of the local formalities, the customs formalities, the bunkering of the vessel, all of the other aspects of looking after a ship, getting it into port, getting it back out again, getting all of the crew fed and watered, getting the ship inspected, getting the cargo unloaded, getting other cargo loaded. Now, you're supposed to do your job well. You're supposed to do it to the best of your ability. But ultimately, you're a salaried employee of the ship owner. Let's say something terrible happens during the unloading of the cargo and all of the cargo is lost. You're still sitting pretty. You're still paid your salary. You still have your little villa on the outskirts of Riga. You're as happy as anything because it's not your cargo. It's not your ship. My life is not my life. I'm an agent who's been entrusted with a life. I'm not a body, I have a body. So I'm an agent, I'm an intelligent agent. Nothing wrong with intelligence as long as it's paired with humility. Spearheads of God's ever-advancing creation. If one feels one's life is purposeless, maybe one cannot see that one is a spearhead of God's ever-advancing creation. But this is the point of trust. This is what trust looks like. I can't see myself being a spearhead of God's ever-advancing creation. I'm going to take it to be true and give it no further thought. And either God will reveal why it is true or God won't. But whether or not God reveals how that is true is not a factor in whether I believe it. So when the book says, you'll be fine, when God, through various channels in the world, says to me, you're going to be fine. You're fine already. You've always been fine. My job is not to understand it. My job is to go, oh, okay, marvelous, and give it no further thought. The truth does not need the truth does not need my thought to make it true. It doesn't need my agreement to make it true. It's going to be true, whatever I think. So I might as well take the quick route and just say, well, if that's true, it's true. Ongoing work as an agent. What form does that take? mostly sponsorship and other message carrying. And that can be 12-stepping, it can be the business end of public information. In other words, the bit of public information where you're literally saying things to people in the outside world. That's the lion's share. All of the other service stuff is good, but it's what makes the carrying of the message possible. And for the individual doing it, it's good, but there is nothing like sitting with alcoholics in person or on the phone. It really doesn't make any difference because it's a spiritual action, not a physical action. That's the bulk of it. Then there's practicing the principles in all our affairs. But we'll note, we've talked about it before, I'm sure, if an alcoholic failed to perfect and enlarge his spiritual life, how? Through work and self-sacrifice for others. So this is the other term, and this goes on forever. You wake up every morning, there is the work of the day to perform. Now, the actual decision of step 3, there's the specific prayer. God, I offer myself to thee, to build with me and to do with me as thou wilt. Relieve me of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. I'm not going to say anything about that because to me it's completely plain. You might need to think about it for a minute for it to become plain, but I think it's plain. I think it can't be improved. Now, sometimes people say the step 3 prayer every day, and sometimes people say it many times a day. And if you do that and you're loving it and it's working for you, have at it. I don't want to disturb you in that practice, but I do not say it every day. I think there is a value in having seasons for things. Christmas trees are nice because one has them only at Christmas. If one had them the year round, they'd cease to be special. And it's the same with a lot of things. So I reserve the prayer for any discussion of the prayer or saying the prayer itself. I don't say it at other times. I don't like ending meetings. Sometimes at meetings they say it at the end, or some morning meetings I've been to in America, they say the step 3 prayer every morning. We've already got morning prayers for that. And there are other prayers which express the idea. But I want this to mean something when I actually do have to take it. I almost don't want to cry wolf. I don't want to wear it out. Because when I really do need to reaffirm the vows, which I sometimes need to do, I want something powerful which is pristine in its little wooden box, ready for that occasion. I don't want something I've been carrying around in my pocket all day, every day for months and years. I want something which is special, and because I only use it rarely, it retains its specialness. The actual decision also has a setting. Now it says, we find it very desirable to take this spiritual step with an understanding person, such as our wife, best friend, or spiritual advisor, but it is better to meet God alone than with one who might misunderstand. I don't disagree with any of that. When I try and take step 3 with someone else, I'm too self-conscious to think about the meaning. So I just do it on my own. And if other people want to take step 3 with someone else, they can grab someone else, but I'm not the right person for that. To me, it's an intensely private thing. And then, and then the wording. So the actual decision also contains a wording element. It says the wording, of course, was quite optional, so long as we express the idea, voicing without reservation. And of course, if you want to reword it, good for you, and just go with that if it helps. I can't fault it. I know it's these and thous, but I can't fault it. So I couldn't come up with anything better. There's a lot in there. The next idea is the immediacy of follow-through. So next, it says, we launched out. And if you think about a ship going down the is it called the slip? Whatever, when a ship which is in dry dock is being launched down the slope with a steep gradient into the water. If it goes too slowly, it's going to get stuck. It's got to overcome the friction. And it's the same with this. One must get cracking with step 4. Now there are a few little things here. The first one is in taking step 3 and looking at the next few pages of the book. We have an answer to all problems: resentment, fear, behavior, things we call problems, and trouble. The solution to resentment is a prayer. It's not right. Sometimes when people are resentful for a long time, you'll say, well, what are you doing about it? They say, well, I've written about it. But have you said this prayer? This is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? God save me from being angry, thy will be done. If it hasn't worked, it hasn't been said enough, is my experience. The answer to fear. All men of faith have courage. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let him demonstrate through us what he can do. Only I can do my trusting of God. God can't do my trusting of God for me. I have to make the decision to trust God. What does that mean? It means disbelieving my mistrust. It's saying no to my faithlessness and saying, if God says I'm going to be all right, I'm going to be all right. That's the end of it. That's a moral decision. It's not a psychological problem. It's a decision about what I'm going to take to be true. My own thoughts, my own fear, or the promise of God. Behavior, the answer to bad behavior. We asked God to mold our ideals and help us to live up to them. That's the entire formula. There's nothing more to be said. Food, sex, whatever it is, it boils down to that. What about things I think of as problems? Page 120 dispatches these very swiftly. Place the problem, along with everything else, in God's hands. That means to stop thinking about it. Dr. Paul Lowe said, if I think I've got a problem, I've got a problem, even if I haven't got a problem. If I don't think I've got a problem, I haven't got a problem, even if everyone thinks I've got a problem. If I place the problem in God's hands, what's in my hands? No problem. If I still think I've got a problem, I haven't put it in God's hands. This is a child could understand this. Adults struggle with it. And if trouble comes, avoid then the deliberate manufacture of misery. How? By thinking miserable thoughts. I did not know that my misery was caused by thinking miserable thoughts. It stands to reason when you think about it, but there we go. It bypassed me. If trouble comes, we cheerfully capitalize it as an opportunity to demonstrate his omnipotence. The results. I think there are 3 great results beyond the wonderful fact of not having any more drugs or alcohol. Is to have a philosophical structure where I have a value, an identity, and a purpose. The book talks about this. People of faith have a logical idea of what life is about. So, what is my identity? Intelligent agent, spearhead of God's ever-advancing creation. What is my value? I'm of God, as is everyone else, so incalculable. That's the end of low self-worth. To have low self-worth after that statement is because one hasn't trusted the statement. Not a psychological problem, it's a moral problem, it's a humility problem. And purpose, what is my purpose? To seek to do God's will. That's the end of those 3 discussions forever. Signed, sealed, and delivered. I now have a philosophical structure to live by. The second result I've termed okayness no matter what. Follow the dictates. There's no arguing with dictates. Following the dictates of a higher power, and you will presently, in the present, live in a new and wonderful world, no matter what your present circumstances. Clever use of present and presently there. Uh, and this is my experience. It doesn't mean one isn't in pain. One can be in tremendous pain, particularly if someone dies. That's a very unusual form of pain because I'm not going to go too much into grief, but there is a spiritual ripping apart, like the two pieces of Velcro being ripped apart. And that has a very specific pain, which is particular to the grief when someone dies and unlike anything else. You can be in that tremendous pain, but be entirely okay and entirely at peace. And the last result, which is rather an unexpected one, but a great one, is the conversion of costs to assets. I won't introduce you fully to the notions of double entry bookkeeping. Any among you who are familiar with double entry bookkeeping will know that a debit is either a cost or an asset, and it's how it is used. If it is thrown away and not used, it becomes a cost. If it is used to create an asset, it is no longer a bad thing, it becomes a good thing. It goes from being a bad thing on your profit and loss account or income statement to being a good thing on your balance sheet. All of the terrible things of my past seem to be being made use of on an almost daily basis. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the actual doing of step 3. We'll get on to the wretchedness of step 4 next week, specifically resentment. We probably won't get past resentment, so it's a good topic for next week. So we're going to do questions now. If you can pop your questions in the chat, because we're recording and I'm doing a backup recording which won't record your sound, if you put the questions in the chat, that's the best place. So feel free to start typing away. It's a very good question. Is step 3 only done once or daily? If you think of it like marriage, Don Fritz said, uh, if you want to have a good relationship with God, thy will be done. If you want to have a good marriage, thy will be done. I think there's an awful lot in that. Marriage is a good analogy for this. I'm married. We only got married once. There is such a thing as the reaffirmation of vows. We haven't had to do that. But it doesn't stop you on a daily basis saying that you love the other person. And it doesn't stop you having to pull yourself up short and switch your actions more towards the service of the other person, forgiveness and tolerance and patience and all of those things. So I would say step 3 is done very infrequently. It may need to be done more than once. When one goes through the steps a second time, formally one reaffirms the vows. But there's nothing quite like the first time one takes step 3. I think that affects a change which continues in perpetuity. When I said to God, here's my life, I think God said, right, it's mine now. One can try and run away from that, but not successfully, not permanently, not fully. Even if one drinks again, the thread gets very, very thin. But the memory of that having been done is always going to be there. I don't think it's takeable back if it's done with some depth and sincerity, but it needs to be implemented on a daily basis. So I think one can express the sentiment on a daily basis. God, you take the whole of my day. You take the whole of the things going on in my life. I can't touch any of them. But that's different than the fundamental commitment in the same way that a marriage um, isn't reperformed. Although I would say in the morning we do need our thinking divorce, which implies a remarriage to the ego overnight. But that's another question. So there's a good question here. Can you please explain what does it look like to you when God reveals himself? Well, some people have had actual sort of visions and so on. I didn't. I've had moments where I've been very clear that there was a presence, but I'd be hard pushed to say what that was other than a feeling. But one doesn't know if one doesn't know, was that wishful thinking or was that real? This revelation, one hopes that it might be lovely. Often it's in the form of conscience. I'll give you a really good example. When I was, well, I think it's a good example. When I was 17 years clean, I was in a compromising situation. I'll let your imaginations do the rest of the work on that. I was in a compromising situation and I thought, uh, you know what? I could just take drugs in this situation. Wouldn't it be easier? Life is a bit tricky at the moment. And I immediately thought of the impact this would have on all of the people in my life, and I was horrified. That is God revealing himself. I think there is such a thing as the coincidence that is too perfect to be a coincidence in the sense of two utterly unrelated events which are related. There are things which are too spooky, too bizarre, not actually to be related. And I see quite often the pattern of my life. Uh, I think, 12th century Spanish Jewish philosopher, Moses Maimonides, will correct me, someone, if I get the century wrong, but you don't need to, said that the awareness of God is like seeing a landscape lit up by lightning, and in a flash you see everything, and you spend the rest of the time trying to recall what you saw in that moment. I think that's pretty good. I'm suspicious, perhaps needlessly so, of those who see the Virgin Mary every time they go to church. Maybe they do. I, I, I'm more. There was a Welsh poet called R.S. Thomas. Uh, the three great Thomases of English language poetry: R.S. Thomas, Dylan Thomas, and Edward Thomas. Edward Thomas, I think, is the finest of the three. But anyway, R.S. Thomas, who was a parish priest, said that prayer was like throwing stones up at the window, the upper window of a beloved, and one would have given up long ago if one hadn't once seen the curtain twitch. He was a priest, and he was uncertain. I think there's a lot of validity in uncertainty, and but the awareness of a direct presence is rare. But increasingly over time, I can see the pattern, and then the rest of the time, I can trust the pattern. So it's not because I'm seeing the pattern the whole time that I trust. I've made the decision to trust what I see in those remarkable moments. Um, when you mention about bringing a behavior to God, for God to mold the ideal, what if it happens to be a process that could be regarded as an addiction? Well, it's exactly that. God, how would you have me work? What would you have me eat? When would you have me eat it? How much would you have me eat? Over to you. It's the same. I found it to be the same with everything. And eventually the habits are developed and one can let go of the ideal because one has grooved that as part of how one lives. You can do performances with steps, absolutely. But nothing beats going straight to God on the basis of having completely failed and mercifully having recognized the fact. Many ways to find out if you're channeling God's will or ego. We'll cover this properly. This is a whole session. But as I said, the application of common sense, knowledge, experience, the advice of trusted others, or preferably one trusted other, whether there is a presence of selfish motivations, playing it through. Who will benefit from this proposed course of action? What are my objectives? There are lots more, but that's good for 10 to 15 years. I think it's also said that uh, the ego answers first, often the case, not always. The ego can be shouty and mean and vindictive. If the plan involves any sense of vindictiveness or punishment of anyone, including myself, it's not God's will. But sometimes God's will is very difficult. So you can't tell by whether it feels nice or not. That's not the test. When you're working with another addict, do you go through step 3 and step 4 in the same sitting? And if so, well, we're going to cover this next week. With the step 3, we take a long time to prepare for it. And then I say, go to a church, go to a hill, go to a somewhere, say it, come back. And then what we do is we start reading. I say, give me a call, we start reading the book, and we read and discuss until we get to a line which instructs us to do something. Then I say how to do it, then they do that thing, and once they've done that thing, they call back saying, I've done the thing! And then we carry on reading and go on to the next thing. It's simplicity itself. Very good question. When I do a good deed, how do I know whether I'm being self-seeking or whether I'm acting in accordance with God's will? Okay, this is a complex question, so bear with me. We've got to define what a good deed is. A good deed is a deed which does more good than ill in the long term, taking everybody's interests into account. There are times when the good deed done to me was a very sharp slap indeed. So the witch in Into the Woods says, you're not good, you're just nice. I'm not good, I'm not nice, I'm just right. And the distinction between good and nice and right. So a good deed is not necessarily a nice deed. A nice deed is not necessarily a good deed. And a good deed is certainly not necessarily the right deed, because there could be a better deed than the good deed. If you ask me to repeat that, forget it. The short version is there is a distinction between nice and good and right. What I'm shooting for is right, not nice, not good. The right thing is always good, but the good thing is not always right, because there could be several good things. Sometimes a good thing is to call someone and see how they are. It's a very good thing. But then that stops them from having the rock bottom they need. And what they needed to do was to wait until they were at the end of the line and then make the call. You just put them at the beginning of the process again by being nice. So one's got to be very careful with being good. Now, as for motivation, one assesses what is right to be the absolute best thing that can be done for all concerned, and taking time into account. Now, that's an intellectual objective. You can tell you're self-seeking by saying, what am I after? If I'm after anything, I am self-seeking. That is the nature of self-seeking. If the only thing that I want is to do what is right, which is the best possible thing, then that's fine. It's okay for me to seek that. But if I'm seeking any particular outcome for myself, particularly at the cost of someone else, then that's the self-seeking I'm to avoid. But the complexity is this. It's almost impossible to do anything in the world without self-seeking lurking round the corner, looking out for how it's going to benefit. So the fact that there is self-seeking involved, as there almost always is, doesn't mean that the good action is a bad action or the right action is the wrong action. What I've got to make sure is that the decision is not being driven by self-seeking. So if the right thing is to go and sponsor someone because they asked you, and in the back of your mind you think, oh, that's one more sponsee, look at how many sponsees I've got, good on me. And then you say to yourself, well, I shouldn't sponsor them because that's just puffing up my ego. You're turning down an opportunity to do the manifestly right thing in order to try to control your own ego. No, 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 that's not how it works. The way the ego will get controlled is by doing the right thing and having God burn it off you like they burn warts off with silver nitrate. One doesn't avoid the right thing in order not to give self-seeking its day. If the right thing is the right thing, it remains the right thing, regardless of whatever else the ego is throwing onto the cart. And on that, I think we're finished, Keith.